For now, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Spectator's economics correspondent, Kate Andrews, and the political editor of the New Statesman, Stephen Bush. So welcome to you two. So let's take a look at what's making the front pages. And health officials are under pressure, says The Telegraph, as fears grow that the coronavirus infection is far more contagious than previously thought. The lead story in the Financial Times says that businesses are still closed in China despite the government's efforts to restart the economy following the deadly outbreak of the coronavirus. The Times also leads on the coronavirus infection, saying Britain infected 7 with virus. The Metro reports on the storm of the century as Kira brings hurricane winds and floods to the UK. And it's a similar lead for The Express. A storm of the century batters Britain is the headline there. Floods and chaos, a storm of the century hits Britain, and there's more to come, warns the Mirror. Internet chemists cashing in on UK HRT crisis, they say, as some women are charged up to 4 times the NHS price for treatment. That's the Daily Mail's front page story there. So, Kate Andrews and Stephen Bush here with me to talk through some of those stories. And a number of the front pages lead on coronavirus. You picked out the Telegraph's take tomorrow morning. Pressure on health chiefs over British virus super spreader. Not an expression I'd heard before, this super spreader, as they put in inverted commas there.
Yeah, so this is it must be said, slightly sensationalist name for a man who is believed to have passed on the virus to 7 other people. Now, the reason why that is slightly surprising is ultimately the virus is not that virulent, right? It doesn't pass on to that many people, in the same way, if a friend of yours got a cold, you're probably going to get it. If a friend of you's got coronavirus, you'd actually be quite unlucky to get it. Now, this man didn't know that he was that ill, has passed it on to several other people, and there is pressure to kind of, release more detail to the public about his movement. Now, of course, the reason why health authorities aren't doing this is they have contacted the relevant people, and then the big problem in any sort of global health instance, particularly one like this where the death rate is actually incredibly low, is not the consequences of the virus, but the consequences of the panic. And I do think some of these front pages, of which this is a pretty good example, unfortunately, are a bit irresponsible and are sort of, I think, spreading fear rather than spreading useful information.
It is a difficult balance, isn't it? Because there are some health experts who are coming out and saying that they are concerned about the spread of the disease. And when you hear that the numbers of dead have now exceeded those of SARS, which at the time we thought was pretty bad. It's more than 900, I think. We've just got the new figures in, certainly over 800. You can understand why people are worried.
Yes, these most recent figures of 904 people dead are absolutely tragic. Every life lost is. I think, as Stephen points out, though, it's very important to remember that the death toll is actually very, very low compared to who's been infected so far. And if we compare it to something like the seasonal flu, again, the death toll is very, very low. I mean, sometimes thousands of people die every year in the UK from the flu. Very sad, but we know that these people tend to already be unwell, they tend to be vulnerable, and so you don't want to panic. And while it is the case that it appears that this man will have infected others with the coronavirus, which he didn't know that he had until very recently, what you don't want is anybody here, especially in the UK, where we have not seen mass outbreak by any regards, sniffling or sneezing and having that mass panic and thinking that they have this virus. So it is a difficult balance, but as we can see in this article, Public Health England has said they're not releasing the patient's information. And I think it's actually very important. While many might feel compelled to track whether or not they were near this person, we've seen a country like China, which did release huge amounts of information about people who were exposed. And sometimes that is the difference between a liberal and an authoritarian society. There have been some criticisms that Public Health England could have been a bit better about communicating information in Wuhan to British citizens who are still there, but I think we have to trust that the relevant people will have been contacted, and there just can't be mass panic around it.
Well, yes, and you feel for this individual as well,
absolutely.
who obviously would not have deliberately infected anybody and is currently in a hospital themselves.
Oh, so, yes, and is sick, so our thoughts are with them, of course.
Yeah. Shall we move on to the Financial Times and their take on the coronavirus? And they're focusing more on what's going on in China, aren't they? Shut businesses hit China drive to restart the economy despite virus. And of course, the impact on China is enormous when you've got whole cities that have been shut down and a huge number of companies closing and people not travelling.
Yeah, and I think this is where the comparison with SARS becomes really sort of instructive. When SARS was happening, China accounted for 3% of GDP growth on its own, and then, of course, much more than that because of its trading links. Now, China alone counts for 15% of global GDP and has far many more trading links with the rest of the world. So, the effect of any sort of global health scare is you shut things down, you have less trade, you have less economic thing. So, this is, in many ways, actually, the economic consequences of this virus will probably actually end up harming many more people, including fatally, than the actual biological consequences of the virus.
Yeah, it's Chinese New Year. It's around Chinese New Year, and this has been problematic on multiple fronts, especially because it would be the time that people are going out to restaurants and, spending more money. And mass cities have been completely shut down by this. The government, though, is actually encouraging them to extend it by 10 days, not necessarily because they think people will be out shopping, but because it means that fewer people would feel compelled to go into work. The article reports that people are still working from home. And we have to remember that China is the world's second largest economy now, as Stephen points out, accounts for a huge percent of global growth. And there are questions as to whether or not they're going to meet their internal targets now because of what's happened the first month of the year.
Okay, let's move on to another issue that you've spotted. This is on the front page of the Daily Mail. The headline is Internet Chemists Cashing In on UK HRT Crisis. And the crisis, in case people aren't aware of it, is there a shortage of some forms of HRT. And so what exactly is the Daily Mail suggesting is going on?
Well, they're suggesting that women are turning to online pharmacies and they're trying to get this drug straight to them without going through a GP. And they're also being charged, it says, up to 4 times the amount that the drug would cost on the NHS. I think there are two issues here. The first is if people are accessing a drug that really should be only taken when you're being monitored, and that is one of the criticisms in this article, that's an issue in its own right. People shouldn't be taking medicine that doctors are saying, we need to be monitoring you, we need to make sure you're safe. But then there's a slightly different issue here. It makes sense that if something is rationed, as many drugs are in the NHS, if you feel compelled, if you want to prioritize getting that drug to you, you may well turn to the private sector, and that's often what it's there for, especially in the UK. Now, many people are priced out of the private sector in the UK, which I think is problematic, especially when you have a rationing system like the NHS. So we should separate these two problems about people accessing drugs that they shouldn't be able to access without, close monitoring, and also the fact that if you prioritize getting something to you and you can do so through the free market, then you should probably be allowed to do that.
What do you think, Stephen? Do you think that's right?
Well, I think in terms of the sort of, the free market implications, right, ultimately, the problem here is the reason why there's increased demand is there's a shortage, and actually, the more pathways you open to people being able to panic buy, the more you increase the shortage. But actually, the big problem here is not that people are being overcharged. It's that they are buying a product that they ought not to be without having the advice of a medical professional. And I think actually the harmful thing here is not the price. It is the women who understandably are worried when they see stories about shortages, who worry about what it means for them if they can't get the drugs they need, turn to the online private sector, which is not particularly well regulated, and receive products that possibly aren't the ones they need in an environment they shouldn't be taking them in. So I think in many ways the price is a bit of a red herring here.
Well, yes, and that wider story about the shortage is obviously a deep concern for a lot of women, and the shortage continues. So a lot of questions need to be answered on that, but that's clearly not for today. Let's move on to the Metro's front page, because another story that has got a lot of attention today because it has been the most extraordinary day of storms. Storm Kira wreaking havoc. A number of the papers call it Storm of the Century.
Yeah, Storm Kira is being described on multiple front pages as a storm of the century, and it's going to expand into Monday. Already we've seen some flights being canceled, even trains having been either shortened or people encouraged not to travel. So it's certainly having a very temporary impact, but of course the actual flooding may have much longer term impacts. So it's all about those safety warnings and making sure that you and your friends and family are safe first, and then turning to the damage that's going to have to be cleaned up.
That's right. I mean, and then horrendous for areas that have experienced flooding in the recent past, going through it all again.
Yeah, I mean, so Cumbria's been particularly badly hit by, the first set of floods we had at the end of last year. Now they have more floods coming in, so it's very hard and very difficult. I mean, it's one thing to have, so on my own street, 2 cars have been written off, but it's one thing to have 2 cars written off and quite another to have flooding ruining your home, your possessions, particularly in cases where some people feel they've just sort of narrowly survived keeping their possessions through one set of floods, now having to deal for another. So one's heart goes out to them.
Absolutely horrendous for them. Right, we're going to take a break. Lots more issues to get our teeth into after the break, including government accused of Huawei witch hunt after raising a red flag over the 5G network. That story in the Financial Times in a moment. Tonight, Kate Andrews and Stephen Bush. And I nearly said Kate Bush there. And Stephen
Well,
Andrews.
a promotion for me.
I'm sure she'll be along for it. It's not a promotion, it's just different. Anyway, Kate Andrews and Stephen Bush. Let's turn aside the Financial Times next, because Huawei continuing to take out column inches. What's the latest on this? The headline is Tory MPs accused of Huawei witch hunt.
So several MPs, including sort of heavyweights like Ian Duncan-Smith, David Davis, and Damien Green, have written to Number 10 to ask them to basically rule out the idea that Huawei is going to have any meaningful part in the building of the 5G telecoms network, and that will eventually be phased out over time. Now, this isn't the first time that they've addressed this. On Wednesday at Prime Minister's Questions, both David Davis and Damien Green, who are real heavyweights in the party, have history there, very well respected. They're not the new kids on the block. Stood up and asked some challenging questions to the Prime Minister about Huawei. So we are starting to see what could be sort of the first divide and struggle for Boris Johnson within his new big majority of MPs who just think that pursuing Huawei is completely the wrong decision. His MPs are on the side of America and Australia, who have ruled it out, and Boris Johnson is going to have to continue to work with them, not just foreign powers, as to how he justifies involving the Chinese 5G company.
Well, yeah, and it's causing a huge amount of heat, this issue, isn't it, within the Conservative Party as well as elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, is right, and the reason why, of course, it matters more within the Conservative Party is because now that they have a majority, is whether or not 40 Tory MPs are sufficiently mounted to rebel. And what is causing the whips a great deal of anxiety is what these people have in common is their respected senior Conservatives who are nearer the end of their careers than the beginning. David Davis is never going to be in the cabinet again. You can't threaten him. You can't do anything. If he wants to rebel, he's going to do it. And it does, and they are very well organised. And this is why it is starting to cause some slight concern at the top of the government is, do they have the numbers to inflict a defeat and to force them not to go with Huawei?
Interesting stuff, one to watch. Okay, let's move on to the front page of the Daily Telegraph. We've dealt with the main story, but there's a second story on that front page. The headline is Climate Protest Bill May hit PM's policing pledge. A hark back to all those protests, of course, that we saw in London mainly.
Yes, there's going to be a bit of a standoff as to who has to pay the 31 million that is racked up from protests that we've seen. Is it supposed to be Whitehall? Is it supposed to be the centralised government? Or should the London mayor be paying for it? Should Manchester's mayor be paying for it? How national, how regional is it going to be? And I think it actually just goes to highlight how problematic and disruptive these kinds of protests can be, and that the money does ultimately fall on the taxpayer to pick up the bill in some respect, whether that's from paying locally or paying nationally. And one has to wonder, I'm not quite sure what these millions of pounds add up to, but one does have to wonder how much those who actually vandalize property will be picking up that tab. Obviously, it shouldn't just be the taxpayer who has to pay for that.
Well, yes, I mean, vandalism is one thing, but raising awareness and causing disruption, people might think if that does cost a bit of money, it's worth it if the message gets over and action is taken.
Yeah, and also actually the bulk of the cost of the extra policing for protests isn't about the people who are, violent or disrupt things. It's just about the people, right? In the same way that the bulk of the cost when Arsenal play Newcastle later on this week will not be people who are going to be disruptive. It will just be the police directing people like me past Arsenal train station.
But if only Extinction Rebellion had the thoughtfulness that we now have around modern day football, I mean, it really did shut down huge parts of towns and cities in order for normal people to get to work.
Yeah, but equally, it doesn't really change the fact that you don't have a protest if you don't stop someone, and the bulk of this money is the cost of protesting legitimate, peaceful protest. And I think, Sadiq Khan does have a really strong point here, right? It's not his fault he's the mayor of the capital city, therefore central government should pay.
Okay, we're out of time, but you will both be back at 11:30. For the moment, thank you. Rather stories that have taken your interest. To kick off with The Guardian there, they are going with a story about the victims of the Windrush scandal and ongoing issues for them. So what exactly are they saying here?
There's deep concern that the Windrush victims may not be getting properly compensated so far, despite assuming that the budget would be somewhere between 200 million and 570 million pounds to compensate those who were either put in terrible situations or actually illegally deported from the UK. They've only paid out just over 60,000 pounds to 36 people. Over 1,000 people have actually applied for compensation, but they believe there could be up to 15,000 people who would be eligible. And I think that this just reminds us, especially in the wake of leaving the European Union and what's going to happen to European migrants who are already in the UK, that getting immigration policy right is a very tricky business and one that we're often not very sensitive to. And if you get it wrong, it can actually be life-destroying. We saw for the Windrush migrants that people who were usually vulnerable couldn't necessarily stick up for themselves. Some of them were actually removed from their home. We certainly, going forward, should not be repeating the mistakes of the past, but we must also compensate those who have been through a terrible situation because the Home Office got it wrong.
Well, that's right. And we are due to hear more details, aren't we, quite soon about the government's immigration policy post-Brexit. Do you agree with Kate there that there are some salutary issues that should be taken from the Windrush case when considering what to do next?
Oh yeah, I mean, so there are huge sort of lessons of the kind of failure that led to the Windrush scandal. Because essentially what happened was with Windrush is we changed our immigration laws to take account of people who wanted to come here in the future, and this unwittingly caused problems for people who had come here or whose parents had come here, 40, 60 years ago, in an age in which people did not have identity cards, who suddenly were being asked to prove something that we had told them they would never need to prove. And the Home Office proved to be utterly incapable of dealing with that. And to be honest, there are two big changes in our immigration. One is the fact we will set entirely the level that people can come here when free movement within the European Union ends. But the more important one, and the thing which will be keeping me awake at night were I a government minister, are the rights of the 3 million or so EU citizens who are already here, who again, right, they are people who, they came here being told one thing, that has now changed. And the Home Office has consistently shown that it struggles to understand and get to grips with that. And one of the reasons why Windrush took so long to come to light is the people affected were primarily elderly. They were people who perhaps had downsized, so they got rid of documents they didn't think they needed, and they weren't that well linked into the media, whereas the people who will be affected if EU settled status is as badly run as the Windrush scandal as being, and as badly run as this compensation scheme appears to be, will be young people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, people who are well connected in the media, who are in work. And if I were the government, would anticipate that would be a lot more politically painful. They're both morally equally problematic, but if settled status is treated as badly as the Windrush compensation scheme has been, that is going to be an utter disaster for the government.
Okay, let's move on, because there's a couple of issues that you want to try and cover, and let's move on to the next leadership campaign underway. So explain what's happened here.
So under the rules of the Labour leadership contest this time around, you don't get given access to members' data to contact them and ask them to vote for you until the process to get on the ballot is officially over. So despite the fact that we know that Keir Starmer, Lisa Nandy and Becky Long-Bailey are all going forward to the next stage of the contest, none of them have been given the official data to contact members. However, there was a vulnerability in Labour's dialogue system which allowed people to circumvent this. And what's happened is when the Keir Starmer campaign's designated point person, so under GDPR, every organisation has a person whose job it is basically to ensure they are following freedom of information laws, and if they aren't, they are the one who is sort of on the hook for it. They reported this to Labour HQ, saying, look, here's the exploit, here's how you can get around it, you should fix it. And they've now been reported to the Information Commissioner by Labour HQ, saying, look, they violated it. Now, the Keir Starmer campaign feels that this is essentially a bit Kafkaesque, right? They're like, we're the people who've gone up to someone and said, your door's unlocked, mate, you might get robbed. And they phoned the police and gone, you're planning to rob me. HQ says, well, we think they're exploiting it. But what it's really about, as it always is in the Labour Party, is about power and control. Labour Party headquarters wants one candidate to win, Becky Long-Bailey. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. Keir Starmer is likely to end up wanting a different set of people running HQ. A very similar movie, some people will say, to the one which played out in 2015, when you once again had a Labour HQ which was looking at all the signs Corbyn was going to win and going, is is there some way we can avoid this?
And of course, Labour HQ would say, well, that's not the case. We're trying to play this completely fair.
Yes, they would say that. I think Stephen's highlighting, though, sort of the broader tension here between those who want to see the Corbynista agenda continue to prosper and those who think that it's time to move on. And I mean, after such a grueling election for the Labour Party and such a bad defeat, you are seeing more traction towards candidates like Keir Starmer. Wasn't it Corbyn's constituency actually showed preference to him first, not the continuity candidate Rebecca Long-Bailey, who is, coming up with a lot of the same talking points.
She hates that expression, of course.
I'm sure she does, but she did give him a 10 out of 10. And she's picking up a lot of the same talking points that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, as a shadow chancellor, were picking up, sort of the more extreme side of socialism. So we'll see how this plays out, but I'm not terribly surprised to see that this is where the heads are butting, between those who want to move past the Corbyn agenda and those who want to still frame the Labour Party with this Corbynista narrative.
Okay, let's move on to touch on a story inside the Daily Mail, and this is about business rates and pressure being put on the Chancellor over it.
It doesn't seem like we are going to be able to get through a budget where the issue of the high streets is not addressed, and there is a lot of pressure to reform or to lower business rates because these businesses on high streets are struggling to compete with retailers like Amazon, who are able to get warehouses not in these ideal high street areas. But I think there are questions about whether or not the tax is fit for purpose, full stop now. I don't think fiddling with it is going to change the fact that people's behaviour is moving more online and away from high streets.
And Stephen, I'm going to whiz on to the next one, and it feels like there's more pressure coming for the Chancellor. Is there a budget coming or something? This is about e-books, isn't it?
Yeah, so e-books are taxed differently to regular books, which many authors, many publishers, many people in the e-book industry understandably think is a bit ridiculous. Now, their policy case is open and shut, right? These authors are 100% correct to say it's ridiculous to tax a book differently, when it's the paperback in my pocket than if it's the one on your Kindle. But because of the very specific fiscal promises that they've made not to raise income tax, VAT, or national insurance, if you're Sajid Javid, you're looking at these quite ambitious spending targets for the NHS and for police. And it's very difficult for you to say, no, we're going to give businesses a tax cut through business rates. No, we're going to do something through VAT. Because every tax cut has to be spent somewhere with fewer public spending commitment. So it's going to be he has got a really difficult job on his hands in this budget. It's going to be a big test for him and for Rishi Sunak.
Okay, and we'll leave that hanging in the air and say goodnight to both of you because we're out of time. Thank you both very much indeed.